So welcome to another focused learning video chat. And today we are joined by Duncan Dunlop, all the way from sunny Scotland. So Duncan, can you just introduce yourself a little bit? Tell us who you are and a little bit about your background and what you've been doing in the last few years.
Hello, Nick. It's good to see you again. I've been a youth worker, I'm reckoning, for over 25 years now, initially in a voluntary capacity. And then when I realized it was a profession, I joined the ranks and was qualified up to master's level. And I guess it's probably informal education, community and youth work. And I've done that all over Scotland, the UK, but also the world. I've been lucky enough to do that. Actually, in the last 12 or 14 years or so, I've been back here. It's about 14 years now. I've been back in the UK, and I've been focused on a lot where I started my youth work journey, working with and for children who've been part of the care system. And that's in what people, different countries might recognize as children's homes, very old school language as orphanages or foster care, as it's generically known in America. There's different definitions of that in every nation, but basically the families whereby the birth parents are not really able to look after them for whatever reason. So they're generally supported and looked after by other people. And that's where I focused for the last 10 to 14 years, working with individuals. I ran a charity called Who Cares Scotland about 9 years, and that was pioneering in terms of the work we did in recognizing care experience as an identity grouping, whereby from birth right through to grave, if that was, nine minutes through to 90 years, there was a commonality in the care experience. Yeah. So a lot of work with that, taken that from being advocacy through to campaigning and lobbying. And then more recently, I've just completed work being the expert independent advisor to the review of the English care system as well. I now work as an independent consultant, developing organizations, care system reform and leadership space.
And you're mentioning care system reform there. I know that has been a big part of your work, on top of the actual running of the organisation there in Scotland. Why has there been a need for care reform?
If you look at any outcome in the care in the developed world, the population, those who are born physiologically, pretty much the same as anyone else. Those who have the worst outcomes categorically are the care experienced population. And you can look at all these things that we don't look like from a deficit base. But where care experienced people end up is doing far worse in terms of education, whether that's your high school examination grades, whichever nation you're in, right through to being, for instance, in the UK, might be averaging out now about 6% of them will get to university, but that's comparable to the rest of the population, 40% will get to university. Yeah. If I look at it, the thing that really got me engaged with this subject was the numbers in Young Offenders Institute. I remember visiting Parliament here in Scotland when I first came back in about 2009. And the governor then told me he reckoned up to 80% of the young boys we were incarcerating had come from the care system. Wow. And that's from 1.5% of our population. They were 80%. You look at anything, mental health, 50% leaving care was a serious mental health issue or condition. You look at homelessness, and not just homelessness, rough sleeping. Over 30% of them will be care experienced people, and often they're leaving the care of the state, the wealthiest parent in any of our nations, and they're dumped straight into what being, I think, critical issues confront them. So basically, and then the worst one that really got me going, we got Nicola Sturgeon, the First Minister of Scotland, on, was I estimated that the death rate was there were 20 times more likely to die before the age of 25. Wow. I'd extend that to premature deaths below the age of 40, actually. I've just buried a very dear, not buried him yet, he's on his way home. He died last week in Finland, a very dear friend of mine who did a lot of campaigning work, care experienced. That wasn't due to the usual causes, which are suicides, which are drugs overdoses. This was accidental death, but that is the other actually fact, the other one that normally exacerbates the death rate. But we don't see this as one of the major issues in our societies. Yeah. And yet we pump billions into it in terms of caring for them, and it fails miserably.
Yeah. And how are young people from the care system perceived by the public in general?
What's interesting is limited research on it. I'd almost say, and it's something I always see, like I coach a mini rugby team now in Scotland. And what I do proactively is go and try and get those kids I know who are in the cusp of care or in need into that team. I want them in my team.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because I know about the rugby that they need to be connected. And the reason I know, I also know is they're often rejected. And what we do as society from age of about 2 or 3 onwards, we do start judging children. Well, that behavior is not appropriate. I don't want my child mixing with that. Whereas, so a child might be kicking or punching or using inappropriate language for their age. We immediately see that child as a threat.
Yeah.
Instead of saying, hang on a minute, that's a child. What can we do to get involved there and make their life a little bit easier for a part of the time? So a lot of what we're cautioning saying, oh, yeah, issues there. Let's stay away at distance. And so what I think some of the issues are is that we think in general, when we look at, and there has been quite a lot of research in this in terms of the framework, some institute people's attitudes and public attitude surveys on it. But really what we see care as is basically, it's a bit of a, is that they're either too damaged for us to be able to help them, yeah, and so we don't have the skill base to do it, so we don't realize we could be part of the solution. That we can get in and help them, or that they're actually beyond reform and that we won't be able to help them.
Yeah.
And therefore there's no point. So it's a mixed bag, but what I really think with this population is incredible ignorance, such the hidden in plain sight in our society. Yeah, we kind of know there's foster kids, there's children in children's homes or residential homes, but we don't really think about why they're there.
Yeah.
And at best, what we do judge, and this is proven in research, is we think they've got feckless parents. And therefore they're undeserving families and they should have sorted themselves out, without realizing this is often intergenerational in terms of the poverty and the abuse, and therefore it's struggling parents and families who struggle to bring up their children. So the state intervenes at vast expense.
Duncan, what's one of the most fundamental needs for young people in the care system?
The most fundamental need, right, that any child has, and we don't recognize it, most of us, because we have it, but they don't have it necessarily, is love. And it isn't yet a children's right, and in my mind, it certainly should be. So the preamble of UNCRC, we take this seriously and understand the power, the healing, positive energy of it. It's love. Love is the one thing that all these children require. Yes, therapy, support, a number of other issues you work alongside it. But what we are able to do as youth workers is recognize the quality of a loving relationship that is not bound by time or money. It is a fundamental change factor. We have got that conversation going within care system reform, but it's fundamental that we recognize the power of love and talk about it freely within youth work terms. We have to get more comfortable with it. It is vital.
And where is youth work in all of this, or where should youth work be in all of this?
Well, for me, it should be one of the most fundamental starting points of youth work, isn't it? Everyone has youth work. Yeah, look, youth work in a voluntary capacity in different levels makes an incredible impact in people's lives. It did in mine. I had a stable family upbringing. I was lucky, but it was going to youth camps and various interactions totally transformed the way I saw life and how I saw myself, built my confidence. I get that. But when we're looking at youth work to add value as an intervention in our society, and we often talk about this with things like teenage pregnancy, sexual education, we'll talk about it even around drink, drugs, we might even talk about offending behavior. We never talk about it in terms of care. We never see and think about the fact of the most fundamental children in need are often the ones who, from mainstream youth club, you're excluded, your behavior is not good enough.
Yeah.
Because, well, why is that behavior not good enough?
Yeah.
I always work from youth work from the premise that there's no bad child. There's some pretty awful parenting out there, but even that can get to the same decent result, even if it's a very hard slog to get there. If there's decent values, there's continuity and stability they're put within a child. But if you can see a child doesn't have that stability, doesn't have someone caring about them, doesn't care when they go home, that they are unkempt, that they don't have the usual resources that you'd expect most children to have, and there's nobody there that really matters to them, then youth work should have a red flag up going, we need to help here.
Yeah.
Because we can be a source of stability, a source of self-worth and a source of belonging for that child, to help them realize that they do matter. Because the real predicator to all those negative outcomes I talked about earlier is they do not need to exist. I campaign and worked in this now, so intensively for the last 15 years, but last 25 plus. And the reason children have bad outcomes is they don't believe they matter. Yeah. The reason they don't believe they matter is they do not belong to somebody. And what I mean by belonging is, they're not loved. It's not unconditional. Nobody holds an unconditional relationship with them. Everyone in life, if they're in the care system, are paid to be part of their life, or it is a time-bound relationship.
Yeah.
And if you think of any other relationship that really holds a young person, we do many youth work programs and projects and camps. They are adding value so that the core relationship that's holding the child and cares about them daily, whatever level of dysfunction, is able to therefore be nourished and supported so the child can flourish. Yeah. But if you don't have that core relationship, then it doesn't matter what intervention you're putting around a child. It doesn't sustain. It really doesn't. And so what I think youth work needs to do is recognize with a big flashing light, this child has not got strong relationships around it. They're not unconditionally loved, or they're at real risk of not being that. How can we help? How can we help identify the people that can be without getting too technical on it, but someone they can be a mentor? How can be someone they can help and they go youth work or volunteer? Maybe that mentor or youth work volunteer might become their foster parent. Maybe it's an informal arrangement. Maybe they just go for their tea one night. Too much of our modern systems is, if you have a concern, report it. Yeah. I know what happens if you report it. It is not, to the majority of the time, to benefit that child, because it's often reported. But nobody steps in, he knows the child and says, I care.
Yeah.
What's going on? Not just so I report it, so I can help you. You trust me, you told me. How can I help you? Who else matters to you? Youth work has such a key linking role here in saying, these are the people that matter to this child. They trust us because of the nature of the youth work environments we create.
Yeah.
And we should be saying, no, we want to play a role, not just pass on to social work, and mapping out who matters to these children and these families so we can be part of the solution. Until you're 12, you don't really have much of a voice. There's a children's hearing in Scotland, there's various court mechanisms, family courts in England, and there's similar mechanisms across Europe. What we don't do is properly understand what the child wants. Youth work does that. Social work comes from a best interest perspective. A court and state intervention is what's best for this child. We know with youth work and youth participation is, what do you want? What can you do as an active agent in your journey? That voice and perspective is not respected at this stage. And if you did that, you would say, there's some great projects that came across. One saying, you say who? And you say who started with to the child when they had child protection measures, going, who matters to you? And out of 110 children they used this with, 106 stayed a sustainable length of time with the person that mattered to them. And it might be a teacher, it might be a youth work volunteer. But the point was, what we can do is say, this is the issue. So instead of seeing addictive behavior as, if I want to look at other bits in youth work, it's like, don't look at problems with drugs or alcohol. The number of people I know with severe addictions who aren't just trying stuff out are because they realize drugs and alcohol masks their pain. The commonality of a care experience is one thing: you've been exposed to trauma. You've been exposed to a traumatic experience, and more often than not, that has impacted upon you and will impact upon you for life, in the sense you have to continually heal yourself via therapeutic mechanisms or avoiding certain behaviors or relationships to keep yourself healthy. And this is what we have to realize is, how do we start looking at what caused the need to take alcohol, drugs, or whatever else it is in a risky way, or seek a relationship? We look at sexual abuse or how child sexual exploitation in these spaces. What are the children running away from? Why are they being attracted to somebody completely inappropriate, offering a vodka and other substance? It's not just the totally inappropriate behavior of the perpetrator, but we can also look at the vulnerability of the child within their own family situation. The solutions that lie around everywhere. And one of the things that is great about youth, for me, my thing is, it was youth and community work. My great solution, I spent years analyzing care system. The solution lies in your community, around what I'd call a high school catchment area. Yeah. The same way you call a youth work patch back in the day, or exactly what you just described with Colin knowing his territory. because you know the kids and the families are going to need it. And we should push people to invest and understand and support them to do it. That's led by youth and community work. We should be far more inquisitive about the behaviors behind it. So for me, there's a huge question that we have to ask ourselves as a profession. Why are we overlooking this population? Because its needs are as great in terms of the oppression that's gone on around this identity. As I'd say, it's almost more prolific than you would see in terms of the liberation we've seen with the sexuality, the LGBT community, around race, around gender, around disability, numbers of issues where people have managed to organize around those features whereby they are suffered significant discrimination, and we've had progress. Care experience, 150 years old at least. There's no organized community. I've done my best to develop that within Scotland. There is, I guess you call it, embryos of it in various pockets now. Helped sort of develop some of that in New Zealand. I know they're trying to do it across the UK and Ireland, but it's very weak and very limited considering there's hundreds of thousands, millions of people actually in the UK who are living with a care experience. It's a source of great shame, this identity. And we do not enough in youth work to make it a safe space for children to know, to be able to talk about I'm care experienced. I'm care experienced and not to be judged. Because the reason it's difficult isn't just the trauma that might bring back the memories of it. It's the fact there's something really hard to say. My mom and my dad could not love me.
Yeah.
There's nothing more shameful and shame-making in a child's life than to have to own that. And so to own that, you must do it in safe spaces, with people you can trust, not necessarily in a group of your peers. You don't know that will be used with or against you. So it has to be really carefully done. I'm not sure we're inquisitive enough in youth work in that way. So one of my fundamental things is youth work first has to educate itself on care experience to realize it is a fundamental tool in transforming their lives. I employed, Who Cares Scotland, about 150 odd people. I employed a lot of youth workers, but none of them have been trained in care. Yeah. They learned that as they went through it. And I think that is our major need, is let's recognize this as a group, the same as we would sexuality, race, other issues that I mentioned. We have to be the pioneers in this and enabling this to be the liberation movement that is now discussed actually in the formal care review we just completed. It's gone to the Department of Education under a Tory government, has called this the civil rights issue of our time. The civil rights issue of our time, a formal government review has concluded that. And it's called for care to be seen as the next protected characteristic in the equalities legislation. So it has given the same parity of understanding the way we frame things around those issues around sexuality, disability, race, etc. So we must start seeing this, and youth work has to play a role in this. We're meant to be cutting edge and radical. We're meant to kick up against the system. We have ignored this for too long, far too long. We should be having conferences in this, discussing it, where are we at, and we're not in a good place with it. All of our governments are spending billions in this, or millions depending on the size of it, and they are failing. In Scotland alone, with 5 million people, they're spending over £1.5 billion. What's that these days? I don't know. €2.5 billion on this. And it's failing. I'm still burying these young people at the rate of 1 a week as they're young adults. Yeah. And they're totally preventable deaths if we enable these young people to be fully functioning, to fully fill their potential, realize they have the confidence and value in our society and can be loved. And we do still little in undernet. But we have a responsibility, and no greater responsibility, I don't believe, in a developed world today to do this. And where it's happened, in places like, you see iterations about fighting for this and against this, was in Canada, and I can't remember the details, some appalling colonial behavior whereby we used to herd up the Indigenous people of Canada and put them in the quasi-state boarding schools away from their own families and their own people and try and educate them. And they recently found mass graves in the grounds of where these schools would be. The people who raised this as a significant issue were, of course, the Indigenous people of Canada, called out as a race issue. In New Zealand, the Maori population, the iwi are united there to say the care system still isn't reformed to the right degree. They have been the ones that said this is a race issue, the numbers are coming into care and the way they're being handled. A race issue, not a care issue. In Scotland, I can't remember the exact name of the old-fashioned orphanage, it's Cillian Orphanage, you can find a link for you. They found hundreds of children buried in the grounds of that, and it hardly got a byline in our newspaper. Why is that? because they weren't representing another group that could fight for their rights. There was no intersectionality. They were just children who didn't matter in our society. And for the vast majority of the children in the care system in our developed world today, that's all they are. They don't matter.
How can what they are learning in youth work be transferred to their daily lives? Or rather, what are the positive things that they can take from youth work that can be transferred into their daily lives?
You can do stuff. You're great. We'll give you some of the parameters to get on in society. We'll make you feel valuable. Yeah. The crucial bit isn't the curriculum pieces on life bits. They can teach us incredibly wildly, more wildly than we'll ever be in some aspects of life, and incredibly naive and ignorant in others. Yeah. I remember taking one young lad to speak at Directors of Social Work Conference, and he was 25 years old, and we sat down in the hotel the night before because we were the keynote speakers, and we sat down at a restaurant, and I suddenly realized he'd never ever been in a restaurant in his life. 25. Might have been to McDonald's, but he'd never sat down with waiter service in his life. Not allowed at 18. He'd never put petrol in a car. Things like that. It's like, well, they could live in the streets if you like for a week, but they didn't know how to do basic things like that. A boy spent 6.5 years in prison, gave him his first job. I'm emotional because he's dead and he died 10 days ago. But the hardest thing he overcame in his life was walking through our office door for his first job, because it was a very different culture and environment. He didn't know how to turn on a computer far less use one. He didn't know how you make tea in an office environment. He didn't know any of that. He knew how to live wild out there in the wild, in the wild side. But the core brilliant qualities of that young man didn't know how to do it. And it took him his biggest courage. He talked about it. His biggest difficulty in 5 years of work was walking across that threshold. So some of the most basic things we look at care experienced people, we take for granted in our lives, they don't have, because nobody taught them it. The system said it's not safe, can't do that, doesn't pass a risk assessment. And what youth work does is give them belief. It gives them relationships that may well hold on to them for life, particularly voluntary ones. And we should be the system should enable people who work in our profession. I've always found brilliant-hearted people to do that. Yeah. But it should also recognize it's the real simple bits that give them magic. I've had people be married at the youth camps I've run. I'm not sure that was a great idea. Yeah. Well, there's I've had children from them, but that's not the point. The bit that really mattered, the really bit that was they had self-worth. And when you really are taught you don't fit from the age of 3, you don't get invited to kids' birthday parties. Other kids are given a severe telling off, but even hanging out with you. Yeah. Your teacher says you're late and you're disruptive, you don't belong. Youth club didn't let you in because you didn't have 20p back in the day. Probably, whatever it was. We exclude. And it's a sense of we ought to be the pioneers to say, these are our people. These are our most vulnerable, necessary people. And I've had people do youth work lectures on, don't exclude from your youth club.
I'm going to have to stop you.
That's not the conversation.
Duncan, I'm going to have to stop you there because we are really, really out of time. Thank you so much for sharing all of this and these deep insights into a world that I think too many of us as youth workers are not aware of and not connecting to. Thank you for sharing this and for being with us today.